Hello and welcome to Fab Canberra, the podcast that brings you into the conversation with leading experts exploring what makes Canberra great and how we can make it even better. You're listening to our first series, Carbon Neutral Canberra, where we hear about our city's net zero journey from the people making it happen. In this episode, Fab Canberra Director Martin Greenwood talks with distinguished environmentalist and town planner Professor Emerita Barbara Norman and leading renewable energy expert and former ACT Deputy Chief Minister Simon Corbell about how Canberra's world-leading 100% net renewable electricity policy happened and what it can tell us about achieving the ACT's net carbon neutral by 2045 target. This is Carbon Neutral Canberra from the Centre for a Better Canberra.
I'm Martin Greenwood, the Director of the Centre for a Better Canberra at UC. The Centre is a think tank for our city, launched as part of the University of Canberra's Connected Strategy. We provide thought leadership, public policy development, and we highlight the role that UC academics and research plays in making Canberra the great place that it is. We meet this evening on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge other families with ties to the land of the ACT and reflect that as our discussion tonight is on the theme of climate change, at its core, it is a discussion about effective stewardship of the entire environment. So the ACT has a legislated commitment to achieve net zero by 2045. In 2020, the ACT achieved its target of 100% renewable electricity through a unique reverse energy auction process. This got us a long way down the road to net zero. Having delivered this innovative, world-leading policy, the single biggest source of emissions here, now in Canberra, responsible for over 60% of our current emissions, is transport. This Carbon Neutral Canberra series is about the policies that we need to get us the rest of the way down the net zero path by 2045. We are lucky enough to be joined tonight by two key figures in the ACT's world-leading climate action. Former Deputy Chief Minister, Minister for the Environment and Minister for Capital Metro, Simon Corbell. Simon held an incredibly broad range of portfolios in his time in the Legislative Assembly and has since been the CEO of the Clean Energy Investor Group and is currently Chair of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria. He is an alum of the University of Canberra and is helpfully one of the directors of the Centre for a Better Canberra. UC's Emeritus Professor Barbara Norman is Chair of the Urban Policy Forum, advising the Australian Government, National Chair of the Australian Coastal Society, a co-director of the Oceania Hub of the Urban Climate Change Research Network based at Columbia University, a former National President of the Planning Institute of Australia, and for 7 years was Chair of the ACT Climate Council. So we're here tonight to talk about the unique way that the ACT came to be powered by 100% renewable energy and what this can teach us about the transition to net zero. I'll stop talking and hand over to you, Simon. Could you tell us a little bit about the inside story of how the Territory came to be powered by 100% renewables?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to have this conversation with you. So I think I'd like to start by busting some myths about
Excellent.
the 100% renewable energy target. I hear a lot of people say, Labor Party only did that because the Greens did it. Or the Greens compelled us to do it. And it's not quite true. The history of the program arose initially because in 2008, there was an ACT election. And this was at a time when you might recall that there was a really strong level of concern about climate change. The Rudd government had just been elected, ratified the Kyoto Agreement. Very high level of voter sentiment around climate change action. So Labor Party locally was going in 2008 election, and the then Chief Minister said, right, we need something that responds to that particular issue in the community. So John Stanhope, as Chief Minister at the time, promised, right, we're going to build a solar farm. We're going to build a solar farm. We're going to put X million dollars on the table if we're elected, and we'll build a solar farm. So the government was returned, albeit in minority, and John asked me to become Energy Minister. So I had to work out, right, well, how are we going to build this solar farm? So we went out and spoke with the industry, we spoke with investors, we spoke to technical experts, and the really clear message was, there's no shortage of capital, even now, and there's even more no shortage of capital today, but there was no shortage of capital then to invest in a solar farm. The issue was returns on that investment. So a cash grant really wasn't going to, make any difference to the development of that piece of infrastructure. So we started looking at alternative mechanisms, and the mechanism we chose was a form of contracting called a contract for difference, which basically guaranteed a level of revenue for a project. And we decided to award that through a competitive process, a reverse auction process. So that was a form of competitive tendering where the private sector had to come up with their best possible price per megawatt hour for the electricity that would be delivered. So why were we doing all this apart from that election commitment? The other key element was we just committed to some really important climate change targets and had legislated those, including a 40% reduction on 1990 levels by the year 2020. And because electricity was the single largest sector of the ACT economy in terms of emissions, that was where we needed to put our effort. So I went through the process of developing this proposal, and then I had to sell it to my cabinet colleagues. And I have to tell you, that took a few years. There wasn't an immediate agreement about how we would approach this question. And one of the most important things I was able to do was I was able to bring independent experts to bear in the conversations internally with my cabinet colleagues, particularly with the Chief Minister and Treasurer at the time, to convince them that this was an effective and rational mechanism. So, we had our first Climate Change Council. I think, Barbara, you were involved in those discussions. But I think you were explicitly in those discussions in relation to the reverse auction mechanism. And other people like Frank Yotzo, who was also on the chair, a very respected climate economist, climate and energy expertise from the economic sector. And we're just bringing that expertise to bear was really important in convincing my colleagues that this was worth a go. So eventually the submission went to Cabinet, and I didn't get agreement for 100% renewable straight away. I didn't get agreement for the 700 megawatts of generation that we ultimately supported straight away. I got permission for 20 megawatts. That was all I got, 20 megawatts. So we'd introduced the legislation, set up this reverse auction process, but I could only award 20 megawatts, and I had to go back to Cabinet and I had to report to Cabinet on the outcomes of the first auction, because the ACT scheme relies on what's called a consumer pass-through mechanism. So it relies on ultimately energy consumers meeting the costs of the scheme, if there are costs. Consumers also receive the benefit if the strike price, the price paid by the generator, is below what the wholesale price is in the market. So, but the consumer bears that cost if that strike price is less than the wholesale price for a period of time. So we ran the first auction, and the Whyalla Solar Farm was the first successful project. And at the time, we had no real market experience of what the cost of large-scale solar was in the country. All we had were economic projections. So the Bureau of Resource Economics projected that the cost per megawatt hour for large-scale solar in the country should be around $350 megawatt hour. That was what the Bureau of Resource Economics projected. We ran our first auction and we came in at 240. So I was able to say to my cabinet colleagues, look, we had projected the cost to consumers would be this, but it's actually been this. So it was much lower. And all of a sudden, that allowed Whyalla to be built. And as a consequence of that, I was able to get more cabinet support to do more auctions.
Keeps it going.
And ultimately, we ended up with 700 megawatts of large-scale wind and solar across the country.
Fascinating. Simon, you mentioned the importance of external expertise as part of that process. Barbara, at the time you were, I think, running the Centre for Urban Regional Futures at UC, amongst other things. What was your perspective on that?
I think it was incredibly important, not just what's called Canberra Urban and Regional Futures, which we established about the same time, actually, at the University of Canberra, and I ran for about 10 years. but it was actually the importance of collaboration and partnership. There is no way, in my view, that this would have been achieved without that kind of strength and collaboration particularly between University of Canberra and ANU, and then CIT came in with technology, and the governments and other policy NGOs, head of the social NGOs within community NGOs in the ACT. And, we talk about windows of opportunity, and for some reason, all these people, we came together and we're on the same pathway. And great credit to Simon for his leadership in that. I had the pleasure of chairing really the only climate council in town, when I say that, in this country. And I have to say the flow of capital, I think, was influenced by that as well, Simon. We were the only game in the country. And so I think the leadership there and the early adoption of this pathway, the ACT and its residents have benefited considerably since. Canberra Urban and Regional Futures, what we were able to provide was this continuous series of evidence-based reports along the way. So we did work on climate change adaptation for the region. We did it on renewable energy. We ran seminars, community seminars. Dare I mention light rail? We also pioneered our research in that as well, which is all part of the bigger picture, of course. And so I think that that research coming in, but also that continuous conversation. And actually, I'm really delighted in that sense that this entity has been created, because when I stepped down as a full professor 2 years ago at UC, I said, well, that's the end of Canberra Urban and Regional Futures after 10 years. But I said publicly in a press release, I won't be surprised if there's another entity like this that's created very soon, and it was. So I was very, very happy with that. Can I just say that also, because there was, not the only reason, but as there was a national government missing in action during this period, I have to say that kind of inspired us even more collectively. But in fact, what we ended up with, the people on the Climate Council in the ACT, was an amazingly talented council. And so you mentioned Frank Yotso, Will Stephan, leaders in their own right, not only nationally but internationally. So we had this rich ACT Climate Change Council able to advise and give confidence, I think, at times, if I remember some very interesting conversation, give confidence to the Minister to be able to take his arguments forward to Cabinet. And so I think that was important too. And lastly, on international engagement, because we were internationally engaged in our own right, we could see where the future was, or is today as well. And so we were able to provide that advice in a very credible way. Will Stephan, myself, Frank, all contributing authors to the IPCC. So we had international standing amongst our peers, and a long association myself with UN Habitat. And so we could see this transition to renewable energy across the world. We could see it very clearly, and we needed to be part of this, but we were able to give very credible advice and bring those networks to this discussion as well. So I think coming back, it is all about collaboration and partnerships, but very, very meaningful ones, and trusted relations over time is very important as well. There's a lot of these conversations can be, in confidence, and so that trust is very important. So CURF played a key role, research played a key role, international engagement played a key role, and having the Climate Council established in legislation was really important. One more point, stretch targets. I think stretch targets are amazing. I remember, just one quick anecdote, I remember Simon and myself standing up at the press conference announcing this brave 100% renewable electricity by 2020. I don't think either of us really believed we were going to get there, but we looked very confident. And what that did was set the tone and set the clear guidelines for the public service, for the private sector, said that the government was serious and that the expertise was there. And I think that made a huge difference.
Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. I think you spoke to international collaboration, and Simon, you talked about benefit to the community. One of the things that I've found most interesting in learning more about this is the industry policy element and what you were able to bring to the city that I think is often not more broadly understood. Yeah. Do you maybe want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the history of the industry sort of economic benefit aspects of the scheme is really interesting because initially when we were supporting the renewable energy projects, we had a very specific local focus. So it had to be Canberra or the immediate region, you know, Yass and Bungendore and that Goulburn, that sort of region. And I remember a Canberra-based renewable energy company came to see me and they said, look, we're based here in Canberra, we want to stay here in Canberra, but all of the projects that we're developing are in the broader national electricity market. They're not in the region. We won't be eligible for a scheme that is run by the ACT government. And they said to me, think about expanding the scheme to projects anywhere in the national electricity market. Because if you do that, first of all, we'll be able to participate, but secondly, you actually get better value for money because there's much better wind resource in particular and solar resource. But at that time, the focus was wind in places like Victoria and South Australia, right? So this presented a challenge to me because it's like, well, yes, I can see the logic of that, but how am I going to convince Canberra electricity customers that they should be paying for a project that's being built outside Adelaide or, you know, in southwestern Victoria? And so what we decided to do was, okay, we're going to be able to reduce consumer prices if we have more efficient wind projects. So that's good in terms of bill impact. But in addition, we're going to have an economic development requirement as part of the auction. So we required in the scoring methodology against which we assessed the bids, what contribution projects would make to the broader economic development outcomes in the ACT. Because we recognised we wouldn't get construction jobs, but what else would we get? And what was really interesting is that we got things like lots of use of Canberra-based contractors and consultants, people, again, that sort of knowledge-based economy capability, environmental consultants, electrical engineering firms, those types of businesses. They were being offered contracts to work on these projects elsewhere. But most importantly, we got investment into research and development. So we got millions and millions and millions of dollars into the ANU, into the CIT, into other research activity that has really underpinned growth and development in the renewable energy sector in our city. And we also got commitments from those companies to headquarter or base operations here for the 20 years of the project contract. So you look at a company like Neoen, the French renewable energy investor. When they first started in Australia, they had 2 employees, and one of them was here in Canberra. They now have their largest office outside of Paris, where they are headquartered, is here in Canberra in terms of staff. And it's here for 20 years. And there's another Canberra business, WinLab, stayed in Canberra, grown their workforce here. Spanish renewable energy developer, GPG, the same. So we've got this little ecosystem of private investors, global private investors operating here in Canberra. And then we've got money going to research at the universities, at the TAFE. And we've also got money being dispersed by the ACT government from these private investors to deliver programs, to subsidise batteries, for example, which was run about 8 years ago. It morphed into other things, but those same principles are still being applied by the ACT government today. So really important lessons. And I think the most important lesson, Martin, just one last point if I could on this, is other states followed our lead. Yeah. So Victoria still uses our economic development framework, essentially, for their reverse auctions.
Yeah.
And
so
New South Wales does the same.
In researching this, when you look up the process, the International Energy Agency uses the ACT's reverse energy auction process as the template on their website as an example of how to do it. Yeah. Barbara, do you think potentially this process and project is better known overseas than it is in Canberra itself?
It certainly was early. In fact, there was wasn't until there was the national award, the National Environment Award, the Banksia Awards. I think when this work won that, there was suddenly we are doing something interesting in this town. But before that, all of us spoke about it internationally in forums. And yes, it's an Australian thing quite often, fortunately, but it was well known. But the fact that it's been, and Simon would have been a key instrumental to Victoria taking it up as well, I suspect, that it's great to see that happening.
Yeah. Did either of you see the renewable energy auction process actually locking in lower power prices for Canberra? Did you actually think that would be a likely long-term outcome?
Don't think we knew, really.
I think we approached it very conservatively. So we always approached it on the basis that this will be the maximum impact on bills, and it won't be above that.
Yeah.
So we approached it very conservatively. But of course, what happened, and there was a bit of good luck in it, for sure, but I think we all remember around, 2012 onwards, wholesale prices started to go up really high. And particularly when Hazelwood closed when was that, 2015? Hazelwood Power Station closed with like 3 months' notice, 6 months' notice, not very long. And wholesale prices just spiked. When wholesale prices spiked, we were protected because we were only paying that strike price, that contract price. We didn't have to pay over the odds. So that was a really big benefit. And I think what we did understand intuitively was that energy that comes from renewable energy over time will become cheaper.
Yeah.
And so we felt that there was always going to be some sort of early mover advantage.
Yeah.
How substantive that was, probably a bit of good luck, but you take your luck in politics for sure.
So there was no major consideration of nuclear power plants.
We could discuss that all night if you like.
Don't get me started.
Look, I think you both mentioned it at the same time you were moving down this path of 100% renewable energy. You were both also actively involved in the Light Rail project as Minister in Climate Change. I suppose moving from achieving 100% renewable to lessons learned about how we now make that transition for the transport sector. Do you have any observations on how we take our transport sector zero emissions?
Well, that was a pretty fun time, sort of, looking back. Yes. Well, light rail was harder. I think that we had confidence from the renewable electricity. We knew that we had the smarts in town to deliver. We knew that we had great leadership with Emma Thomas heading up the project at the time, and has gone on to great things ever since. So we knew we had the capacity, but unfortunately, unlike renewable electricity, it became highly politicized. And that, of course, didn't help. There was this pivotal moment, I think, some of you may have been there. It was in Civic. It was a big public meeting. And there were all the banners, can the tram. Might be hard to believe this, but anyway, it's a huge issue. I'd just been in Copenhagen University for some research, and I could see visibly how successful these things could be. So I was kind of fired up when I came back, and even if I do say so, I think it was one of my better speeches. I was put up against a very conservative economist, not Frank Iozzo from ANU, and just went for it. And after that, I don't think I stopped, really. I could see all the benefits. And we were just being faced with these very old economic arguments that we'll just do the economic analysis on the infrastructure itself, but none of the tangible benefits that would come around. So didn't include any of that development you have seen since on both sides, on Northbourne Avenue, and the social benefits and the environmental benefits that have come. You know, we ended up with a project, and of course you should acknowledge our Chief Minister, Andrew Barr, and his leadership through all that we've got a light rail that came in under budget, on time, looks beautiful and works successfully. And I talk about this internationally all the time, and they go, oh, it's really good. And domestically too. So I think we knew we had the capacity, and that gave us confidence. It was just a harder road for a whole range of reasons.
I think from my perspective, what's really important when you think about the two case studies we're talking about, 100% renewables and light rail, is that they both reinforce there is really a place for very clear and decisive government action in these types of transformations. You can't achieve it through incrementalism. You need a much more specific strategic intervention.
I agree.
And
I agree.
you know, and so the 100% renewables was, you know, this was a really clear mechanism that allowed private investment to flow, but did so in the interests of the broader community. And light rail, the model with light rail is very much the same. You know, like that's a privately funded piece of infrastructure where the costs are recovered over time once it's effectively de-risked.
Yes.
And that is, you know, that is an effective way. That's been a very effective way, particularly for a small jurisdiction with a more limited revenue base, to see investment in that type of structure. So they both highlight the importance of these really clear, decisive and big picture thinking. And that's what we're going to need for other sectors of the economy now too.
Do you think though that renewables, well, do you think it was potentially low-hanging fruit, the renewable energy side and some of those major transport investments, with the remaining challenge to get to net zero being in sort of individual transport, waste, construction sector, do you see a potential for a major piece of intervention?
I don't
know. I was going to say the same thing.
I don't think at the time we saw 100% renewables or light rail as low-hanging fruit.
Not at all.
And
No way.
I heard the Chief Minister and response to that, and you know, without his leadership, particularly during the 2016 election campaign, that project, you know, we wouldn't be contemplating any further additions to that project. You know? So his leadership around that, so very important.
And don't underestimate the context, the broader political context in this country during that. We were the outliers. So it took a lot of courage as well.
So I think, yes, in hindsight it's low-hanging fruit, but at the time it's not. And I think it's just the same. We've just got to bring the same mindset to the other challenges we face. And I think there is more work for us to do. There is much more work for us to do, and we need to bring we need to break through some barriers that are making it really difficult for this next stage of decarbonisation. Because the next stage of decarbonisation involve a lot of actors.
Yep.
A lot, you know, every household's an actor.
Yeah.
And that's going to be, the only way you're going to get those households to respond, I think, is through some really significant pieces of architecture that compel and motivate those households to act.
Well, on that note, I'll ask you both one final question before we open up to the audience, which is, if you could click your fingers and have one action occur to get us to net zero, what would it be?
I think everyone knows, because I talk about it all the time, that climate change action should be mandatory in all land use planning decisions.
Land use planning?
Across the country.
I think if I could write a cheque for, you know, $1 billion or so, and effectively subsidise the costs of electrification in households, and provide some sort of rebate, some other sort of offset, you know, in terms of other taxes and charges as a way of assisting with that action. I think that'd be something I'd argue for.
We'll now open up to the audience. Courtney is roaming with a microphone. If anybody has a question, I can't perfectly see the crowd, so
it's pretty bright up there.
Really interested in that private sector contribution to your 100% renewables. What's the opportunity for that private sector investment in the next stage of the journey to net zero?
Yeah, so I think the issue with any private sector investment is they want a return on that investment. So how do you do that in a way that is still equitable and reasonable? When we think about things like electrification of households, you basically need something that guarantees a return on that investment over time. And you might need to do that at a scale where it's not just a return for each individual household, but it's a return for the city as a whole. So think about it as sort of a citywide level rather than an individual household level. But we've seen this already with the sustainable household scheme, right? That's private finance, but it's subsidised by the territory. So there's a guarantee level of return there that allows that finance to be deployed. So that sort of mechanism at a much bigger scale, I think, is worth serious exploration, and I think there's plenty of capital available if we get it right.
I would add that In my experience, private sector responds when there's policy and regulatory certainty and that they can invest in the short and longer term. So when I say something simple like embedding climate change action in all land use planning in the country, or planning acts if you like, and the ACT's sort of headed that way, it means there's a level playing field and they will adjust. But if there's discretion that only some of the leaders will and the rest can get away with not doing it, there will not be the transformation. So I think, again, it's about being serious. The really pleasant thing right now is the change at the national level. You know, we've got the National Climate Risk Assessment being done, so we've got the facts. We've got the Climate Change Adaptation Plan being done, and so we've got some of the options for the future. We've got something I'm very involved in, which is a National Urban Policy Statement to set the kind of sustainable, urban sustainability principles, if you like, across the country. Those three things, and we've got a lot of energy initiatives as well, but I mention those because it is this broader consensus, if you like, across the national government, and because we have a lot of sympathetic governments across the country right now, I think, again, I talk about windows of opportunity, but there is that opportunity right now to set those very clear directions to industry. Can I just say one thing, though, increasingly I find I am concerned about is we're not investing enough in the skills and capacity building to make this happen. We need the engineers, we need the people in energy, we need the expertise, we need the people who are going to build the turbines. We need significant investment in capacity building and training in this country to then make all that certainty and make all that investment happen on the ground.
My name is Jean-Paul Gagnon. Like many in the room, I'm a professor at the University of Canberra.
Well done.
Well, baby professor, you see. So the question pertains to the possibility of getting more revenue streams to do these sorts of projects. And I wonder if our panelists or friends in the room have had much discussions around utilising the forests, marshlands, grasslands and such in the ACT as a means to model the amount of carbon that's being sequestered. And before I get booed, generating good quality carbon credits that could be sold.
Yeah, so I think the use of that sort of credit available from sort of nature-based activity is a growing area of interest. I think that the challenge for us would be, generally speaking, the risk that presents for governments is that basically a private company has a direct financial interest in the management of a piece of public realm or public good. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think there are some hazards there that have to be avoided. I'm familiar, for example, there's been a range of proposals in other jurisdictions nationally where private banks have said, we'll take over and invest and run this piece of estate, public estate, but in return, we will get the ability to sell the carbon credits from it. And I'm not sure whether that's entirely the role of the public sector to look after pieces of public estate in that way. There's sort of an interesting question around privatisation, but I think there are potentially opportunities to do it, but I think you have to find the right landscape to do it in and the right outcomes.
What about other potential revenue streams in this space, say like a tax on carbon? Do you think those are potential options?
Well, certainly internationally, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's just not...
It's not going to happen.
That's just not an option in the federal political environment.
What at a subnational level? I mean, you've got some constitutional issues potentially, but...
Well, we certainly have to get our act together, and you will know more than me on this, Simon, in terms of international trade.
Yeah.
And the European, what do they call it?
Carbon border
adjustments. So, if we want to be locked out of international trade, that's a pretty big risk for the country.
Yeah.
So, yes, we will have to change. It's just a challenge for national governments to find a politically acceptable pathway through. I'm sure it's exercising their minds.
The way the Australian government is approaching this is sector by sector, right? So there's different mechanisms in different sectors that have the same effect as a carbon price, not as efficient as a carbon price, but they do try to factor in externalities in different sectors of the economy.
Hi, Sarah Reid here from Electrify Canberra. Thanks very much. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Chief Minister, for your fabulous leadership in this space. It makes me proud to live in the city that's referred to as Little Norway, and that's partially because of your efforts. So thank you.
And the weather, I think.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, there is that. There is that.
It's very cold this morning.
May it be cold for many years longer. So I think, Simon, to your point about electrification and the importance of subsidy in that field. So Electrify Canberra is a really active community group here, and we've got a number of members here today. We're one of 42 groups around the country that are part of the Rewiring Australia network. We've done lots of advocacy, particularly at a federal level, where probably that subsidy power is really there. And we've had surprisingly little traction into something that actually makes an enormous amount of sense and has huge community support. What advice do you have for us? What can we do to make the difference? We've got the people. It's a good news story. It's exactly what we need in these times. What are we missing? What are we missing?
I think you've got to find really successful scale-up opportunities at sub-national level. I think, it's the same. That's what happened in energy more broadly, with utility scale. It was the states and territories acting, that ultimately gave the space for the Commonwealth to move in and do what they're doing now. So, ourselves, Victoria, South Australia, and now even Queensland and New South Wales, moving at scale in the utility scale energy space. So I think it's the same for electrification. You've got to find the right actor. I'm proud to say in my current role, where I'm chairing the SEC board in Victoria, which is, the state's publicly owned renewable energy business, we are very focused on how do we scale up electrification outcomes for Victorians, and how, what role can the SEC play as a commercial but state-owned business. And that's a really interesting activity, so stay tuned. We'll have more to say on that, but I think it's about finding the right exemplars at a state level, rather than trying to get whole of national government action first thing off the bat.
And also there's a bit of, I'd go internationally as well, there's a bit of healthy competition that occurs when you say Canada's doing this, US is doing this, comparable countries, federated nations, they go, all right, because, they attend, Prime Minister, others, they attend these international forums and they like to showcase we're doing the best. So, a bit of pushing on that side's sometimes helpful.
Yeah, I think it's great insight, actually. Politicians are very parochial and they love to boast. And and there's nothing like success.
Lots of insights.
Nothing like success.
That's right.
To get First Ministers boasting about things.
That's right.
So I think about it that way.
I think we'd be a great pilot site.
Yeah. So.
Thank you. Stephen Bartos is my name. Look, I want to put up a challenge, and the Chief Minister's aware of this because I've raised it in one of the committees of his that I was on, that being net zero is right now was wonderful when you went to it. Congratulations to both Simon and Barbara on that. But there's globally more than 300 cities that have pledged to be net zero. There are, as far as I know, only a handful that have pledged to be below zero, but below zero is achievable. I mean, we see it at a little neighbouring university whose name we won't mention, who has a below zero target, which they're achieving through things like incorporation of wood into building materials, reduced energy usage, energy efficiency, good design. I mean, there's all sorts of ways. If we look at the ACT and our major sectors of the economy, our public sector still has a long way to go. Our tourism sector, I went to a seminar at UC last night where a researcher was talking about savings of 60% on electricity usage in tourism, savings of 70% on food wastage, and amazingly, they also made the customers, the tourists, happier when they did it. So you can actually get a long way. Transport probably takes a little longer. because people are wedded to what they've already got until they need to change. But the ACT government's doing the right thing in terms of the incentives it's now putting in place through registration charges. So I have confidence that we'll get there. Changing building codes, changing tourism. There's actually a lot of scope. It's not that hard to adopt for 2024 a more ambitious target.
Look, I'm always open to pushing the edge, and whether you make that commitment, I'm certainly not advocating that now, but you can certainly start the research. I mean, it's the same that we did in 2011. You can start to explore those options. You can start to build up the research. I suspect it will come in the future, but not to do it just, naively in a sense. We need to do the work, follow the pathway we've found is successful, have the collaboration and the partnerships, invest in that, and maybe in 5 years' time you look back and say, or even in 10 years look back and say, well, thank goodness we started that work. So I'm always, I don't disagree with you. It's just a matter of taking the pathway and working out the time along the process. Yes.
I suppose, all things being equal, if you had the fixed resourcing, noting the broader global environment, where would you prioritise adaptation and mitigation or trying to push below net zero? Or is that a false dichotomy that you refuse to engage with?
You're meaning either we reduce greenhouse gas emissions or we adapt to the impacts of climate change, is that what you're saying? I think that is a false dichotomy today. We used to talk about that. In fact, in the ACT, we had climate change adaptation strategy and a climate strategy. And anyway, we still have a separate energy one. But I think that more and more now we look at anything that we do should reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time minimise or adapt to the impacts of climate change. And if we have that as a more integrated framework, then I think that's a much more holistic way. It's the way the IPCC is going. The IPCC really has just discovered cities, thank goodness. And now its next report, major report internationally, will be on cities and climate change, which is fabulous because we'll start to get some really interesting global examples we'll get data and we'll get some interesting global examples about how we can achieve both together.
Right.
Hi, Jane Cassidy. I'm the National President of the Australian Institute of Architects and a Director of GHD Design. I think, tonight we've been talking a lot about perhaps the operational side of carbon and so the electrification. I think the other big piece of the pie is the embodied carbon. And, as progressively as we get, better at electrifying, the embodied carbon piece of the pie continuously grows. I think it also continues to grow as we ratchet up the building performance targets. I think in terms of embodied carbon, the Australian Institute of Architects has been advocating for a consistent approach nationally to the measurement of embodied carbon. And quite fabulously, the ACT government, through the Building Ministers meeting nationally, currently took that consistent measurement system to the Building Ministers meeting, and in 2025 we will have in the National Construction Code a consistent method of measurement of embodied carbon. So really huge congratulations to the ACT government on that. It's a voluntary system right now and looking for the targets in 2028. I think at the risk of trivialising the incredible work that's been done in the ACT on electrification, it is perhaps the low-hanging fruit, and potentially the embodied carbon piece is a much heavier lift. Although with really great minds like you in the room, wondering if you have some interesting thoughts on what some of those big picture ideas that we might be able to lead with out of the ACT, particularly in the way that we think about investing in infrastructure and leading by example across the country and internationally.
I think there is absolutely that opportunity, and it's often been a real tension inside government between the cost, the upfront cost, as well versus the whole of life outcome. And when you're dealing with a a constrained budget and constrained capital spend, it's very difficult sometimes to make the argument around whole of life saving versus upfront cost. So I think in my experience, parts of government are always open to those discussions, but it does tend to become a quite binary discussion at the end of the day when you're talking about how much to spend on a piece of infrastructure. So really, in some ways, it points to the importance of having a range of voices communicating the nuances around those issues and how they can perhaps be overcome, or the overall benefits that accrue if it's appropriately taken account of and measured. So I think, I would point to the professions in the same way that the professions were very influential in our energy policy, having the professions in the room, being brought into those discussions early and in an ongoing manner around a particular piece of infra, rather than waiting until the brief's already been determined or whatever. That's a bit too late, really. It's got to be much early in the conversation. So I think that's the important leadership role that the professions can play, whether it's architects, whether it's engineers, range of others. Those are voices that need to be brought into the room and help educate decision makers around the factors they should bring to bear in determining what investment looks like in a piece of infrastructure.
I agree with that, and sharing from the professions, whether it's the architects, the engineers, leading practice, case studies, really a sharp presentation with 5 or 6 successful case studies that are actually meaningful to decision makers, say in the ACT, can be quite powerful, I think, and to show that it can happen. And so, I have a great love of Singapore. I sit on a couple of national committees there, and I think there's a lot that we can be sharing in our region. There's Europe and the States, but in our region, there's a lot we can share around this space too.
Hello, Felix Koenigs here from Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. Views expressed are my own, not those of the departments. Yeah, it was great to hear the story around the 100% renewable energy target being set and then being met. You talked about stretch goals as well. I'm wondering whether a stretch goal could be 100% hourly matching of renewable energy with demand across the year, as opposed to just purchasing the same amount of equivalent green certificates per year, and then...
That's definitely
a very topical question. So as I understand it, the federal government has ruled out time stamping in the new Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin certificate, which will replace the large-scale renewable energy certificates at some point in the next couple of years. Without that, you can't achieve that whole of actual renewables across a 24-hour period without really clear time stamping mechanism on that certificate. So I think there are a range of views on this, but I think increasingly we are going to need to have to contemplate that. We should also be contemplating the relative emissions intensity of the period in which the electricity is generated and then sold into the market. So understanding how emission intensive the hour is that you're selling the electricity into also has benefit, because obviously if you're selling electricity into the market where it's not particularly emissions intensive, then you're having less impact than into those periods of the day when it is more emissions intensive. So I think there is still a real leadership opportunity for the federal government around that new certificate scheme, and they should be looking at the significant opportunities for decarbonisation of particularly heavy industry and parts of that can be realised with a time stamping mechanism. So I don't think they've bought that argument yet, but there's still opportunities to revisit that. So perhaps it's a case of getting the REGO in place and then lifting up further what the REGO can actually deliver. So yes, I agree. I think it's a very important issue.
What a fantastically technical question to end on. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Could you please thank Barbara and Simon?
Thank you for listening to Fab Canberra, a podcast from the Centre for a Better Canberra think tank at the University of Canberra. This episode was recorded and edited by Rach White on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. The University of Canberra acknowledges the Ngunnawal people, traditional custodians of the lands where Bruce campus is situated. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and contribution they make to the life of Canberra and the region. We also acknowledge all other First Nations peoples on whose land we gather. How can you offset your weight in carbon with just 1 square metre of urban garden? And how would a former White House sustainability advisor make her local property carbon neutral? Join us next week to hear from urban microforest expert Edwina Robertson, an internationally recognised environmentalist and former Clinton White House Sustainable Development Advisor, Molly Harris Olsen, for a conversation about how we can turn suburbs and even individual households into carbon neutral powerhouses. That's next time on Fab Canberra.